Welcome to the Sustainable Dish Podcast. I'm Diana Rogers, a real food registered dietitian, author, and sustainability advocate. I co-host this podcast with James Connolly, who was a producer on my film, Sacred Cow. I also founded the Global Food Justice Alliance, an initiative advocating for the inclusion of animal-sourced foods like meat, dairy, and eggs for a more nutritious, sustainable, and equitable worldwide food system. You can check it out and join me at globalfoodjustice.org. Thanks again for listening, and now on to our show. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Today I have with me Dr. James Muecke, which I just found out this last name means mosquito in German. So thank you for that. And I got to meet James when I was in Australia in April. Prawn Yoganathon, and James took me and my friend Kristen that I was traveling with out to lunch. It was so fun, and it was just lovely to meet you. And I wanted to kind of let everybody know all about you and what you're up to. So thank you for your time today.
Oh, thanks, Diana. It was wonderful to meet you. You're one of my heroes, and I've certainly read your wonderful book and follow all your blogs. So it's great to be here on your podcast.
Yeah, so you are in Adelaide, Australia, or Adelaide area, correct?
Adelaide is the capital of South Australia. Yeah.
Yeah, and you okay, and you're an ophthalmologist, or yeah. I wasn't. Are you have an active practice now, or have you moved on to other things at the moment that we were chatting about what you're up to nowadays, and I couldn't remember if you have an active practice these days.
Yeah. I actually have a neurological problem with my right hand, which is forcing me into an early retirement. In fact, I'm finishing up in about 4 weeks' time. So coming to the end of my 33-year ophthalmic career, 40-year medical career. So all sorts of interesting things ahead. Love to write a book.
I'm sorry?
Love to write a book, actually.
Oh, excellent. And what is the book going to be on?
About what I've learned over the last 3 or 4 years about type 2 diabetes and the drivers of this epidemic that we're facing worldwide, and my solution to really turn it around. So, yeah, should be interesting. Lots of really fascinating findings.
And I should mention, I'm a huge fan of your photography. You just got back from a trip. I actually used to teach black and white photography way back when I was a school teacher, and you have a good eye for composition. I just wanted to mention I was following your posts there.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that's very nice. We had a wonderful trip had a big birthday a few weeks ago, so we took a trip to Europe, and I went earlier to Ethiopia in March as part of my not-for-profit work, or my non-profit work, I think you call it. And that was just one of the most extraordinary travel experiences, and this amazing array of captivating things to photograph. It was just brilliant.
So let's start with, have you always been interested in nutrition and metabolic health? Is this something that's a more recent interest of yours? How did this all happen?
Definitely more recent. As an ophthalmologist of 33 years, one of the things that we deal with, every ophthalmologist deals with, is the blinding complications of diabetes. And so I've been working with patients with diabetes, trying to prevent them going blind for 33 years. So it's been an ongoing, very significant role of my practice and my business. And so this has been sort of a world that I've lived in, but I only really ever saw myself as the guy at the end of the line treating the end-stage complications of this disease. So it's only more recently that I started to ponder the role of nutrition and diet in this condition. And the thing I think that really nailed it home for me was back in 2018. So about 5 years ago, I was undertaking a documentary with my son, who is a budding filmmaker at the time, and I wanted to look at the experience of blindness, what it means to be blind. It's interesting, as someone who's been involved in this space for so many years, decades really, but not truly understanding what it means to be blind. And so I interviewed 10 people 4 children who were born blind, and their stories were absolutely fascinating. 4 elderly people who were slowly going blind at the end of their lives due to a condition called age-related macular degeneration, which is really, oh, that's my cuckoo clock going off there. Sorry about that. But yeah, 4 people at the end of their lives going slowly blind. Macular degeneration is the leading cause of blindness in our countries, in Australia and in the States. And then there were 2 people who suddenly went blind in the prime of their lives due to their diabetes. And so diabetes is the leading cause of blindness amongst working age adults in our countries. And their stories were incredibly powerful, incredibly harrowing, particularly the story of Neil Hansel, who went to bed one evening at the age of 50 with normal sight and woke up the next morning blind in both eyes, and is still blind to this day. And the story was just so powerful, so harrowing. I actually ended up creating a TV commercial out of elements of the interview, which played nationally in Australia back in late 2018, trying to encourage people with diabetes, with all types of diabetes, not to neglect their, or not to forget having their eyes checked. And from there, really, I started to think there's got to be more to this than just doing what I'm doing, and that was important for me to raise awareness about this. But then started just reading more deeply and reading books around diabetes, particularly type 2 diabetes. And I think one of the really pivotal books for me was Jason Fung's Diabetes Code, where I actually learned that diabetes could not only be prevented, type 2 diabetes we're talking about here, but also potentially put into remission, just changing diet. And that blew me away. That was not something I even knew. I'd never learned about at medical school. My son, who's now in 5th year medical school, 3 years ago in 2nd year, he had an opportunity to do nutrition as an elective. So it's not even compulsory in our major training grounds, nutrition. So extraordinary to think that, and then extraordinary to learn that as a doctor of, at that time, probably 36 years in medicine, not being aware that type 2 diabetes could potentially be put into remission. Blew me away. Anyway, lo and behold, I had this incredible honour in early 2020 of being named Australian of the Year because of my not-for-profit work, which wasn't about type 2 diabetes and advocacy and raising awareness. It was actually about fighting blindness in some very poor communities in Asia, Africa, also here in Australia, and particularly in our Indigenous population. But I thought, I wasn't expecting to win the award, absolutely not. But if I did, perhaps what I should be doing is raising awareness and about the really horrendous scenario that we are in with type 2 diabetes and our chronic disease epidemic. Being Australian of the Year, our biggest health crisis is type 2 diabetes. This is what I should be doing. And so I launched myself into this space in early 2020, and it's been an all-consuming, fascinating, at times challenging and stressful journey. And so I've been, I would say, spend 30, 40 hours every single week in my own time committed to this. It's been an incredible journey. So that's how I've landed here in this world. And that's what I'll be writing my book about, because my learnings have been fascinating.
Fascinating, because I've met quite a few doctors from different disciplines that have decided to go deeper and look into, how did this even start in the first place? Because they spent much of their career treating the downstream effects of bad diet. And, I can think of Dr. Pran Yoganathan, who, he's one of the few gastroenterologists who's actually tackling nutrition. Think of that. I have a gastroenterologist locally who, if he just, you know, if he can't diagnose them with celiac disease, there is nothing he can tell them other than take this medication. And so he sends them to me, anyone with IBS or Crohn's or colitis. And I can usually, if not reverse it or put it into remission, I can help it greatly, just with food. And it's so now we have Gary Fecky, who's sick and tired of amputations. What are we going to do about all these amputations? And so he got interested in nutrition, and now you. I think it might be interesting to back up briefly and just talk about how diabetes causes blindness, because I think, we here in the US, there are now lung cancer commercials on TV, and you see, maybe an older person talking about, I wish that I had never started smoking, and they've got like a trach scar, or, they talk about their lung cancer issues. But we don't see anything about type 2 diabetes, with, all of the horrible things that can happen. So, again, on cigarette containers, there's the warnings, but there's not warnings on the back of a candy wrapper about amputations, dialysis, blindness, bed sores, all of these horrible things that can happen. And it is entirely preventable, and largely reversible if you catch it early enough. And so, so my understanding, and I could be wrong, is that it it changes the blood flow to your eyes and makes the your eyes produce smaller, like little capillaries that kind of bring the blood to the eye, and kind of dilutes the blood flow. Is that kind of how it works? That would. Oh,
Not exactly. I'll go into that in a bit more detail. But yeah, just yesterday, I was driving along home, and I passed two bus stops, both with Coke ads, uh, and yeah, we're still seeing motor vehicle accidents. Buckle up. All very important, of course, but we see nothing about raising awareness about the dangers of what we're consuming these days. So, in terms of eye complications of diabetes, and here we're talking again about all types of diabetes, just
yeah.
bearing in mind that type 2 diabetes makes up close to 90%, if not 90% of the
I
cases
do
around the
often, when
world.
I talk about diabetes, get type 1 people messaging me. So we're talking about all diabetes as it pertains to eye health, but then type 2 in the aspects of preventable, lifestyle related diabetes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I believe they really should have two different
Yes.
names so that there
Right.
isn't confusion. Yes, so two main impacts on the eye. The first is we can see blockage of the fine blood vessels in the retina. So the retina, for your viewers, is the light sensitive layer of tissue that lines the inside of the backs of our eyes. So we can see blockage of very fine blood vessels, and I can go more deeply into that if you want, but let's just say blockage of blood vessels causing a lack of oxygen flow, we call ischemia. And when we have areas of the retina which are ischemic, there's an interesting response which is triggered. It's almost like a healing response where we have abnormal new vessels, what we call neovascularization, which basically just means new vessels, neovascularization, in essence, trying to heal those ischemic areas. And they're fragile and they can bleed. And the bleeding can be a small amount of bleeding, which might give rise to little floaters in the eye. So the blood cells get into the jelly, which fills the inside of the back of the eye. Or it can be more dramatic, and suddenly a whole cloud will appear in the vision in one eye. Or in the rare situation, fortunately, of the man I talked about earlier, where he had both eyes with massive bleeds, which took away the vision overnight, which is a very unusual story, of course. So that is what we call proliferative retinopathy, so a proliferation in the retina and the pathology. The most common cause of vision loss and blindness in diabetes is due to leakiness of the blood vessels, and specifically leakiness, or all the blood vessels throughout the body as a result of diabetes can become leaky. And you then get fluid, basically sugary water, flowing out of the blood vessels into the central vision area of the retina in the eye, the macula, and that swelling of the macular tissues can cause distortion of vision, blurring of vision, and then ultimately, if it's left to progress, it can be blinding. And I unfortunately do have patients who are blind in one or both eyes as a result of that, because it's not been picked up early enough. So those are the two main impacts. But if the ischemia is so great, sometimes that can also result in complete, for want of a better word, death of the eye. And I have had, as an eye surgeon, had to remove people's eyes as a result of complications of their diabetes. Can you
Oh,
imagine that? Gary Feck, you talked about having to remove people's feet and legs from gangrene due to diabetes. It is a very disturbing experience. But what's super exciting, if you're happy for me to
oh
just
yes,
keep on
please. Yep.
chatting. So, as part of this role, actually, that I had as Australian of the Year, I was invited to be on the National Diabetes Strategy. And I was the only one of the entire working group to even mention the opportunity for remission of type 2 diabetes. And I managed to get remission in that document for the first time ever. And then that was released in 2021. And once I was comfortable that that was in there, I then started having a chat to my patients. And I really initially just looked at my patients, or just had chats with my patients who had sight-threatening complications of their diabetes. Everyone's at risk, of course, but I really was just looking at the patients who were imminently at risk of losing vision, who I was actively treating, putting needles into their eye, lasering their eyes. Yeah, it's quite confronting. So just initially started chatting to that lot. And I would say of the first 100 that I spoke to, only one was even aware that their diabetes could be put into remission. So this is a critical conversation that was not even being had at the grassroots level with their nutritionists, dietitians, GPs, etc. So I then wrote to the mutual GP of each particular patient saying, can we explore this incredible opportunity to put the patient's type 2 diabetes into remission? Unfortunately, most were ignored. Some of the GPs took it up, often on the insistence of the patient, and then I started seeing patients come back. And I remember there was, I think, probably the first one that took it on board. His name was Bevan. So Bevan came back after he'd been to see the nutritionist that I'd recommended. And so he was having injections every 12 weeks in each eye. And he came back. I remember the first time he came back and he'd come off his insulin. And then the next time he came back 3 months later, he was off all his medications. And I remember him saying, I've never felt so good. And he felt clearer in his mind. He felt he was seeing better. And this was probably a couple of years ago now. And he's now down to 6 monthly injections in each eye, from initially having injections on a very regular basis through to 3 monthly, now down to 6 monthly. And I'm expecting in the next few months to actually get him off injections altogether, which is an incredibly exciting thing. And I'm seeing this almost universally in my patients with not just type 2 diabetes, because we know this is just a spectrum, but also patients who have pre-diabetes and other conditions which the diabetes is making it worse, such as retinal vein occlusion. There's a bunch of things that I've been dealing with. And so almost universally, I'm finding that the edema, the swelling of the macula, is improving in patients once they start to change their diet. And we can talk about the recommendations there a little bit later. And just earlier this week, I had a patient who a couple of years ago, she put her diabetes into remission very quickly. She came off her insulin within a couple of weeks. It was amazing. And I've watched her macular edema. She wasn't having injections. And just for your listeners, the injections are a special antibody which is injected into the vitreous, the jelly inside the back of the eye, to seal up those leaky blood vessels I was talking about, hopefully allowing the swelling to reabsorb and the symptoms to improve or at least stabilize. So it's amazing how it works. It's been a revolution for us ophthalmologists and our treatment of this disease. It's been incredible. But what I think is almost, which is more exciting, is actually seeing this condition improve with a change of diet. And I'm almost universally, every patient who reduces their carb and seed oil intake, their sugar intake, we're seeing this reversal of their eye disease. And the one I mentioned who put her diabetes into remission within a couple of weeks, I would love to be able to share the image with you, but in fact, I can send it to you if you like. But 2 years ago where she had quite significant swelling of her macular edema, and I was borderline looking at starting injections for her. And now 2 years later, that's completely dried up in both eyes. As a result of her change in diet. And this has never been reported before. So I'm actually doing a number of case reports and case series about my patients, which hopefully be published soon, because this is something we need to get out there. This is remission in action. And I think as an ophthalmologist, we have this incredible fortune of being able to look inside the eye. We can see the damage being done, and we can also see the damage reversing. So it's super exciting. But you mentioned gastroenterologists. There's a gastroenterologist in Adelaide who just recently at a conference talked about reversal of fatty liver when he applied the same change in diet. We're also seeing foot ulcers in patients with diabetes improving by change in diet. We're seeing kidney function improving. We're seeing inflammatory joint problems improving. We're seeing mental health and psychiatric complications improving. It's across the board. We're seeing these improvements, and yet it's so hard to get this into mainstream. And again, you were talking earlier about this. We are in this medicate paradigm as a yeah. So as a medical student, this was something that was I was not aware of, and medical school and let's say postgraduate training for doctors is all about medicating, not deprescribing, demedicating. And travel is sponsored, our research is sponsored, conferences are sponsored. This is just become the norm. This medicate paradigm that means that in essence, pretty much every doctor has a conflict of interest, and it's a conflict of interest which is, let's say, it's benign. It's people aren't aware, but it simply means that you're not exploring other opportunities to change disease patterns or change progress of disease such as type 2 diabetes.
Well, definitely send me that image because I'm able, this is not only audio, but it's also video. And if we have permission from the patient, we can put it up on the YouTube channel. And I should also mention James's, for everyone who's listening, he is watching my face as he's describing all of this, and I do have a little bit of a horror look on my face as he's describing this, and for some reason anything to do with the eye, I mean, I wear contacts and it took me a year to be able to actually put a contact in my eyeball, so the idea of an injection into the eye for me, like there is just no chance I would ever do LASIK surgery because there is nobody touching my eye. So as he's describing this, I am having a very visceral reaction. So it's a good thing I'm not an ophthalmologist.
It's also an incentive not to have diabetes if you can avoid it, of course. But I have some patients who are having monthly injections in both.
I can't even imagine. Can we talk a little bit? I'm just curious, because I know that there are signs of fatty liver way before, full on type 2 diabetes happens. At what point do you start to see vision issues related to the swelling that you're talking about, related to metabolic issues? Like, is this something that's very late stage? I'm just kind of curious, like, at what point do we start to really see the manifestations in people's eyes and sight?
Yeah. So obviously the core metabolic dysfunction is insulin resistance, and they say it takes on average 13 years to develop type 2 diabetes after you become insulin resistant. That's in an adult. In children, it can happen in as little as 2 years. Now, we are seeing it's called diabetic retinopathy, or diabetes-related eye disease may be preferable to some. We're actually seeing that now in children. Fortunately, it's rare. And I'm not aware, and certainly haven't seen any children who have lost vision, and certainly no one who's gone blind as a result of their diabetes. But it's disturbing. We're now seeing children as young as 3 with type 2 diabetes. Just when I was in medical school, maturity onset diabetes was its name. We're now seeing it in children as young as 3, which is unbelievable. We have an epidemic of type 2 diabetes in kids and babies. Extraordinary. So in terms of the eye complications, so in general, about a third will have some form of eye disease, and about a tenth of the total pool will have sight-threatening eye disease. In Australia, we have about 100,000 people with sight-threatening eye disease at this very moment. Um, so I can't tell you exactly when it arises, and some people it arises earlier, others a little later. The story I told you before about the man who woke up blind at the age of 50, he developed type 2 diabetes at the age of 26. So that was 24 years later that he was blind in both eyes. But obviously that was if we'd looked in his eyes some years before, 10, 15, 20 years before, we would almost have certainly seen some form of a diabetes related eye disease. Uh, and unfortunately, he wasn't having his regular eye checks. And what we know, and again, looking at Australia, I'm not sure what the stats are in America, we have close to 2 million people with diabetes, again, all types of diabetes. More than half, probably well over half, because a significant number of patients with type 2 haven't even been diagnosed yet, but well over half are not having their regular eye checks. And that's why it's become such a blinding problem in our society.
I don't know what this because I wear contacts. I go in once a year, but I don't know what the standard is for healthy people, what the recommendation is, or even a regular checkup with their GP. If I mean, I know with pediatrics, my children always got just a vision check, but it was just a very simple, can you see the letter E across the room kind of thing. Um,
Yeah, yes. Well, I can just briefly let you know about that. So, uh, generally, what I would suggest, and we have, again, great fortune in our countries of having access to optometrists. And once we reach our early 40s, most of us will need reading glasses. And that's a great time to go and see an optometrist, have an eye check, a vision check, which is essentially a screening opportunity, and get a pair of reading glasses. And then if everything looks fine, then every couple of years is probably very wise. And the optometrist can pick up things like glaucoma, which is often called the blinding thief of sight. I think it's sometimes called, because a bit like blood pressure, you don't realise you have it, and it can slowly nibble away at your vision, and it ultimately can be a blinding disease. So glaucoma is a really important one to pick up. And sometimes the optometrist will pick up changes in the backs of the eyes, early changes which are suspicious for diabetes, type 2 diabetes particularly, and then recommend that their GP test their metabolic function. So with a patient with diabetes, if there's no sign of eye disease, we generally check them every couple of years. If there is early eye disease, we go then to yearly. But if it's more serious than that, more threatening than that, we may see them every 6 months or 3 months. And then, of course, there are patients, a whole cohort of patients who are having treatment.
Did you know that by the time you're thirsty, you're likely dehydrated? In fact, about 75% of Americans are chronically dehydrated. And even mild dehydration has shown to impact concentration and memory in adults and in kids. Simply drinking plain water is not enough. You need to be adding electrolytes, sodium, potassium, and magnesium, which help your body absorb water and function at its best. My favorite brand is Element, started by my co-author and good friend, Rob Wolf. I really love the citrus flavor, but you can get a free sample pack of flavors with any purchase when you go to sustainabledish.com/element. Element has no sugar or dodgy ingredients and makes regular water taste amazing. It's the perfect way to keep you hydrated and on your game, both physically and mentally. I drink it every day. So check out sustainabledish.com/element for your free sample pack of flavors today. So let's talk about the landscape of how difficult it can be to talk about dietary change. I know that the dietetics community in Australia is very similar to America and Canada in that we're taught that a very large portion of the diet should be carbohydrates. And I know personally, if I ate that many carbohydrates, I know that I would be type 2 diabetic today. But what sort of things, what sort of challenges have you seen in Australia, from your perspective over the last couple of years, being someone relatively new to kind of crusading in this space?
Yes, so this is all going to come into my book, but there's a series of barriers. There's a series of hurdles, and one of the really uh, powerful ones is our Australian dietary guidelines, which really is based on your US dietary guidelines. And they are a high carbohydrate eating recommendation, recommending up to 65% of our diet or calories should be carbohydrates, and down to 27.5% fats in our diet. Now, if you realize that type 2 diabetes is basically a condition where we are unable to metabolize the glucose load coming into the body. So if you realize that the core metabolic dysfunction is insulin resistance, as we mentioned before, then you are, as a patient with type 2 diabetes, unable to metabolize the glucose load coming into the body. So uh, in that scenario, if you can't metabolize the glucose load, and all carbohydrates produce glucose, then you are, in essence, carbohydrate intolerant. So the very last thing we should be doing is telling people with diabetes of any sort to consume more carbohydrates. Now, in the defense of the Australian Dietary Guidelines, they say that they are for the average healthy Australian. They're not for people with conditions or diseases. But then if you realise that the bodies such as Diabetes Australia is recommending people eat by the Australian, with people with diabetes eat by the Australian Dietary Guidelines. Our College of GPs are recommending people eat by the Australian Dietary Guidelines, and a number of other health associations are doing similar. Then it's just fueling this problem. So it's quite extraordinary to me, and yet no one, despite my advocacy, no one is shifting on this. And I've even met with the overseeing body that is the sort of the keeper of the guidelines, and even they won't move. The dietary guidelines 10 years later are under review at the moment, and 2024 is when we should be seeing the new guidelines come out. Now, whether they're going to shift away from this recommendation that you should consume so many carbohydrates, I don't know. I think there'll be some movement, but it's not going to do full circle, which is what is needed for the majority of the population. Where you realise that in Australia, over 2/3 of adults and a quarter of our kids are overweight or obese. I think now in the United States, 93% of people are metabolically unhealthy. We really need to look at what we're consuming. In fact, our poor diet is responsible for more disease and death than smoking, alcohol, and inactivity combined. So this is where our focus should be, and it's pretty disturbing to have meetings with our federal health minister, our state health ministers, and yet we're seeing very little movement on this. Fortunately, they've recently launched a parliamentary inquiry into diabetes, which finishes at the submissions end date is the end of August. So there's a number of us working busily on this to try and raise awareness and lobby the government to make some very important changes.
It's so frustrating because we know that people aren't necessarily going to follow the guidelines anyway, but the guidelines should be right. Like they should at least be like somewhat in the ballpark of correct, for a guideline. And then, if people are going off the rails, that's their kind of, but even the guidelines are completely crazy. When I was working in hospitals, the diabetic conscious diet was 250 grams of carbs a day. 250 grams of carbs a day. I can't eat that.
It's just no, exactly, and all of these bodies. If you look at in the States and in Australia, hospitals, childcare, all the way through to aged care, military service, prisons, they all recommend eating by the Australian Dietary Guidelines or the US Dietary Guidelines. They're a very powerful document. Most people wouldn't be aware, but they do inform health educators, health practitioners, health policy makers, even the food industry, and I've been quite vocal about the current Australian dietary guidelines being flawed, and they're flawed because they continue to uh, discourage the consumption of natural saturated fats. Yet natural saturated fats have not been strongly linked to cardiovascular disease. They continue to encourage the consumption of margarines and seed oils, what you euphemistically call vegetable oils. And yet we know there's plenty of evidence now that these are unhealthy. These are not good for us. So, the guidelines continue to discourage the eating of meat, and particularly red meat. And yet, once again, we know that the evidence for red meat causing any form of disease is very, very flimsy. So I've been lobbying them for several years now, saying we can't continue to demonise all of these products, because it's certainly not helping, and possibly making things worse for us.
Well, I wish I had taken more pictures of our lunch that we had at that lovely steak restaurant where we were indulging in, I think it was steak, mushrooms, butter, and there may have been a couple of glasses of wine as well. And, that's, it's just amazing that, there's been so many advances in so many other areas, and yet we're still really in the almost barbaric dark times of nutrition.
Absolutely, and again, there's so many forces working on this to keep the status quo, because it suits particularly the ultra processed food and sugary drinks industry. And they keep on polluting the literature with very, very, very weak science, and often corrupted science, and it's certainly not helping. And I often talk in my presentations about the fact that type 2 diabetes is largely preventable. How do we prevent it? And we can avoid the whole conversation of vegan versus carnivore just by saying, eating real food, avoiding added sugar, avoiding sugary drinks, avoiding refined carbohydrates as much as possible, certainly avoiding seed oils. And if we look at ultra-processed food, the key ingredients for many, if not most, ultra-processed foods are sugar, refined carbs, particularly wheat flour, and seed oils. So if we avoid those substances and ultra-processed, they call them foods, but they're not foods, they're food-like substances. If we avoided all of those, then the vast majority of us would be in a much, much healthier space. Now, if we're looking at putting type 2 diabetes into remission, that's a more hardline approach. But I think if we all return to eating primarily real food, and particularly avoiding these seed oils, that everything's cooked in, fried in these days when we go to take away or go out for dinner, then surely we would be much, much healthier. And of course, there are other things that we, it's important to mention as well in terms of avoiding type 2 diabetes is, getting a good night's sleep. Exercise, yes, is important, and particularly as we age, and to ensure that we don't lose that muscle mass and the risk of sarcopenia with its risks of frailty, fragility, falls, fractures. I also I don't have breakfast, so I practice intermittent fasting or time restricted eating. And when you don't have breakfast, you have a 16-hour window where you're not eating, and your insulin level drops quite sharply. And insulin is actually a fat storage hormone. So if your insulin level drops, you're actually able to mobilize fat from the stores. So that's another thing that I do, getting out into the morning sun when I can, and encourage that vitamin D production in the body, which is also helpful in improving our metabolic health. So there's a number of things, beyond diet that you can do to help facilitate this, but it really does start with a healthy diet. And often when people change their diet in a lower carbohydrate, low seed oil approach, then they very quickly find that their mental and physical health improves. And we know there are studies that shows within 28 days with people who make those dietary changes, we can see improvement in all markers of metabolic health, what we call metabolic syndrome, in at least half of people, independent of weight loss. So this is not related to weight loss. And 3 years ago, I'm embarrassed to say, I found out that I had a fatty liver. and then I had a scan for some back discomfort, and that showed that I had a fatty liver. And it was amazing that to learn from a radiology colleague that, and I'm not casting any criticism against radiologists, but apparently fatty liver is so common these days that some don't even mention it.
Oh,
Uh, and yet, if you picked up fatty liver on a scan, then that's the first thing that we should feed back to the GP, saying that this person is metabolic dysfunctional. We should actually do something about this. And I, at that very time, I had done a sugar detox. I'd dropped my refined carbs. I'd dropped my seed oils and ultra processed foods. And more recently, earlier this year, I had another scan, and I have no fatty liver anymore, which is really exciting to know.
that yes, the liver is so resilient, and it's so easy. It's easy to reverse things unless they've gotten super advanced. But it is possible. It's never too late to. I think there's a lot of people. I've talked to a lot of people who maybe feel that you know it's too late to make a change, and today is never too late to do yourself a
Never
favor.
too late. Never too late.
Yeah.
Exactly. And even for people, and we know that there are people who aren't able to put their type 2 diabetes into remission, but just by making those changes and seeing the improvement in their metabolic health, it can only be a good thing in terms of the risk of complications, and particularly the cardiovascular complications, the dementia, which unfortunately we see in 70% of patients now with type 2. So I lost both of my parents, my mother earlier this year to dementia. And so this is a condition, a disease that impacts broadly on the entire family and beyond. It's not just something that impacts on the individual. And gee, I wish more people were aware of what lay away if they allow their type 2 diabetes to
Mm.
progress.
Yeah, actually, a question about that. I know that the relationship between Alzheimer's and blood sugar handling, type 2 diabetes is strong. Is dementia also um, related as well?
Yeah, well, Alzheimer's
Is a
is
form
a
of
form of
dementia. Okay.
dementia.
I
Yeah.
didn't know if they were
So,
like two
yeah. So
separate like categories
yeah, there are
or.
a number of forms
I see.
of dementia, but this would be what we say vascular dementia, which is due to, again, the same pathophysiological drivers that we talked about with the eye. The blockage of the blood vessels or the narrowing of the blood vessels. That's also happening in the brain. It's in fact happening
Hmm.
throughout the body. Hence, damage to the kidneys, the fine blood vessels in the kidneys, hence impotence, hence damage to the fine nerves in our extremities. But we also get damage to the large blood vessels as well. Hence, we can see gangrene due to blockage of the major blood vessels to the feet and legs. And that's where heart attack and stroke also
Hmm.
come in.
Wow. How can people learn more about your upcoming book, the work you're doing, your nonprofit, everything?
Sure. Well, there's my nonprofit's called Sight for All, and there are a number of social media hashtags that have a Facebook site, a Instagram site. I'm sure there's YouTube and LinkedIn as well. But equally, myself, Dr. James Muecke, you can search for me on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. I'm not on Twitter. But yeah, so there's, and also you can certainly subscribe to newsletter, Sightfall's newsletter from our website, www.sightforall.org, if people are interested in the work we're doing. And uh, it's wonderful. I took this journey 3 years ago. I stepped not away from Sightfall, but just stepped to the side a bit, which is great in terms of the organisation, able to really stand on its feet, which was fantastic. But it's come back now full circle because this journey I took to see that people could put type 2 diabetes into remission by reducing their carb intake and their seed oil intake, and now starting to see their eye complications reverse or at least improve. We're now bringing this back into Sight for All in our educational sessions, and it's a very special thing to experience. And for me, as a medical practitioner of 40 years, to see patients demedicate and ultimately put their diabetes into remission is the most exciting thing I've been involved in. And I just wish all my colleagues would have this similar experience. And I know many GPs who really were getting disillusioned with their medical practice, who've started to get involved in metabolic health and who've been able to put the patients type 2 into remission, who've been reinvigorated. And it's certainly incredibly invigorating experience to be a part of this. And I feel very fortunate. In fact, I mentioned early on that I have a neurological problem with my hand, which was really forcing me into an early retirement. But I'd arranged to retire some time ago, and it's just been a delay in finding someone to take over my practice. And in the meantime, I've been able to have this amazing experience with my patients. So it's been very fortuitous and very fortunate for me to have had this truly life-changing experience.
Well, I look forward to coming back and hopefully partnering with you in the future. I fully support all the work that you're doing, and it's just really exciting to know that there are other people out there like me who are questioning dietary guidelines and all the standard recommendation and actually helping people reverse and prevent these awful lifestyle diseases that that they don't think they can or they didn't know they could. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for all you have done as well, and to raise awareness about the importance of animal source foods in not only for our own health, but the health of the environment and the planet.
Thank you. Well, have a wonderful day, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Diana.
Thanks so much for listening today and for following my work. If you believe in making sure people all over the world should have access to nutritious food, please join my mission through my nonprofit, the Global Food Justice Alliance. Visit sustainabledish.com/join and become a sustaining member today. All sustaining members get early access to ad-free podcasts plus free downloads, and you'll be helping get healthy protein like meat, fish, and eggs to food insecure kids. That's sustainabledish.com/join. And thank you.